My foster dad started calling my foster mom, the researcher, and sabotaging her work after her big discovery. When I asked why we never worked together anymore, he looked at her project and said, "Just easier this way." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, he was crying in court while the review board terminated his directorship. My foster dad, Dr. Simon Thorne, stopped loving his wife the moment she made the discovery of a lifetime. At first, I thought he was just scared of the implications, but then I realized it was something much darker. 1 month ago, they were a team, sharing notes over coffee, their laughter echoing in the sterile halls of the Polaris research outpost. 8 weeks later, her project was showing verifiable results, and he'd fake comms blackouts when she tried to collaborate with him in a main lab. The director's chair in his office became his permanent spot, and I'd catch him staring at her data streams with this expression of pure disgust. At the communal mess hall, he walked 5 feet ahead like he was ashamed of her newfound prominence, leaving her to carry her own equipment trays. Her lab coat had a new stain once, showing she'd been working through the night, and he audibly sighed. He started insisting she only wears standard-issue gear around the outpost, claiming her personalized lab coat was unprofessional. I'd catch him staring at her old, less significant publications, even outwardly asking her where that brilliant but humble woman went. Every night, she'd still try to discuss their work, but he slept in his own quarters, back turned, too distracted to engage. In the morning, she struggled with a heavy data case, but he stood there watching with that same disgusted look, as if her becoming intellectually stronger was something to hate her for. I asked why we never analyzed data together anymore, but he looked directly at her project's containment unit. "Just easier this way," he said. He soon started introducing her as the boy's guardian instead of my wife and lead researcher to anyone on the comms link. His colleagues back on the mainland didn't even know she was the lead on Project Chimera until she published the preliminary findings. Then came my mentor's anniversary party, which he turned into an opportunity to shame her. My aunt, also a scientist on the outpost, rushed over. "Eris, you must be so excited about the breakthrough." But he stared at her research notes with such hatred that my aunt stepped back. Someone asked about the projected timeline, and he walked away mid-conversation, leaving her to answer alone. He wouldn't say, "We made a discovery." It was always, "She made a discovery." Someone said the new microbial strain might be named after both of them, and his jaw tightened like he was about to punch them. When our colleague, Dr. Peters, congratulated him on being part of such a historic team, he went silent and just stared at his wife like she was the most incompetent woman in the world. I told someone I was excited to be her research assistant. Assistant on her project, he interrupted me. When it came dinner time and she wanted a second protein bar, he made a comment about her getting soft. When her mother, on a video call, defended her and made her feel good about her work, he stood up and made a scene of leaving early. That's when he started taking over my education. "Eris needs to focus," he said, taking over my lessons once a week. Before I knew it, he was supervising my studies every night. "Eris is tired from her project," became his constant excuse. Even when she was sitting alone wanting company, I'd try asking her questions, but he'd intercept. "Don't bother your mother." When she couldn't join the outdoor excursions anymore because her research was at a critical phase, he'd shake his head. "Eris is different now, isn't she?" He pulled out old research papers constantly, pointing at them. "Remember when your mother used to be a team player? She missed my project presentation once for a critical experiment, and he pounced on it. She only thinks about the project now." Watching her struggle with a heavy equipment case, gripping the rail, he turned to me. "See how obsessed she is? That's why we don't wait." The comments got darker. "You and me, we were fine before all this." Then, real scientists always protect their legacy. At her project funding review, while she opened commendations, he pulled me aside. "After this project is published, you'll be forgotten. That's what happens with real discoveries." Eris called me over to help, and he physically held me back. "She doesn't need you anymore. She has her project." Soon, he stopped using her name entirely, calling her she or it when she was right there. The researcher to our colleagues. He removed her from their shared research server, their joint publications, their comms plan, everything. He started throwing her academic journals in the recycler, unopened bills, appointments, messages from her sister. When she dropped a beaker at dinner, he kicked it further away. I watched him throw her nutrient supplements in the garbage while she watched. He hid her access card when she had a critical experiment scheduled. I remember she started choking on water once, and he didn't even look up from his terminal. I had to give her the Heimlich I'd learned in safety training. I remember she collapsed from exhaustion at the lab, and he pretended not to notice. I had to call the medic, and we took her to the infirmary. He didn't even show up. I remember she started experiencing severe migraines, and he just turned his music up to drown out her breathing. Then came my 15th birthday. Eris had decorated the lab overnight and made a nutrient paste cake despite barely sleeping. That's when Simon walked in. "You need to leave." Eris shook her head like she was pleading, but he continued. "Either you leave for the day, or I take him somewhere else. I can't stand being in the same outpost as you." She started crying. I ran to Eris, grabbed her legs. "I want to go with Mom," but he pulled me back hard. "No, you're staying." I was crying, trying to hold her. She wiped her tears and still knelt down despite her exhaustion. She took my hands and hugged me. "Stay and have your party, sweetie. You've been too excited for it not to." He then dragged me back as I tried following her to the door. "Mom!" I screamed while he held me. He shut the door on her, and I pressed against the viewport, watching her walk to her isolated lab alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt guilty about Eris missing my party. So, I got her favorite protein bars from the pantry, hoping to cheer her up. When I heard the decontamination shower running, I snuck in. I opened her desk drawer to leave the bars as a surprise. But inside were papers, old data logs dated 5 years ago. I remembered that timing exactly, when Simon had been promoted to director after Eris's last major project had catastrophically failed. I scrolled through those results, and that's when I saw it. A single line of corrupted code, a ghost in the machine that had wiped her data. But the timestamp on the file, it was from Simon's terminal. I didn't know what that meant, but I could tell it was something important. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold the paper straight. The water shut off in the shower, and I quickly grabbed Eris's datapad from her desk and snapped 3 photos of the logs before shoving everything back in the drawer. I ran back to my room and jumped under the covers just as Eris walked past my door. Through the crack under my door, I watched her shadow stop at her desk. And then I heard this weird gasp. She must have opened that drawer because the next thing I heard was her crying real quiet and saying something I couldn't make out. The next morning, Simon was making his coffee while Eris threw up in the bathroom for like 10 minutes straight. He just turned the comms louder and kept watching the news feed. I filled a glass with cold water and grabbed a washcloth from the hall closet and brought them to Eris, who was sitting on the bathroom floor looking super pale. She pulled me into this tight hug, and I felt tears dropping on my head. At breakfast, Simon dropped this bomb on us about me switching research mentors. Eris's fork hit her plate hard, and she started to say something, but Simon cut her off, saying it was already done and I'd start Monday with some other team 40 minutes away. Eris looked like she wanted to scream, but she just stared at her nutrient paste. Later that afternoon, while Eris napped on the couch, I grabbed her datapad and started scrolling through her texts. There were all these messages from someone saved as Mom from like 2 months ago, begging Eris to come home and saying Simon wasn't who she thought he was. The newer messages showed Eris asking for help, but then the replies just stopped completely. That weekend, Eris asked me to help organize her old research notes. Her hand shook when she pulled out this tiny, framed photo of her first scientific award. She shoved it deep in a drawer like it burned her. She kept whispering stuff I couldn't really hear, except for one part about things not being meant to be. Monday night, Simon came home with this stack of papers and made Eris sit at the kitchen table to sign them. I watched from behind the wall as she read through them, and her face went white as a sheet. She asked him straight up if this gave him co-authorship on her current project if they separated, and his jaw got all tight, and he just told her to sign it. 3 days later was my first day with a new mentor, and the lead scientist kept saying how weird it was to get a transfer this late in the project cycle from so far away. I memorized every corridor and access point on that long walk, counting turns and watching for anything I could remember. The next week, Eris had her medical checkup, and I begged to go with her. Simon actually said yes, which surprised me. Dr. Hoffman took one look at Eris and asked about her weight loss and these bruises on her arms I hadn't noticed before. She sent me to the waiting room, but I could hear her asking Eris questions in this worried voice. Eris kept saying she just bruised easy and everything was fine. A few nights later, I heard Simon on the phone in the garage. "So, I grabbed Eris's old tablet from behind the paint cans where I'd been hiding it and hit record. He was saying how Eris had nowhere to go because her family cut her off months ago, and how my guardianship wasn't final yet, and he needed more time to get everything in place. I put the tablet back and snuck to my room, thinking about what he meant by getting things in place. That evening, I was doing my homework at the kitchen table while Eris sat on the couch, knitting a tiny yellow blanket for her upcoming niece. Simon hadn't been home for dinner all week, and Eris kept looking at the door every time a transport passed outside. She winced and grabbed her stomach, and I ran over with the heating pad from the bathroom closet. She smiled at me while I plugged it in behind the couch and helped her position it against her back. She touched my face and said I was such a good boy and made me promise to always be good. The next morning, while Simon was in the shower, I was looking for my library book in his office when I saw financial statements sticking out of the trash can. I pulled them out and saw all these big withdrawals from their joint account, with amounts like $500, $800 every few days. At the bottom of the trash was Eris's debit card, cut into 4 pieces, and a letter from the bank saying her card was reported lost and a new one would be sent to the primary account holder. I put everything back exactly how I found it and went to my new lab. But I couldn't stop thinking about how Eris had asked Simon for supply money yesterday, and he said they were tight on cash. That Sunday, our friends James and Grace came over for dinner, and I helped Eris set the table while Simon watched sports in the living room. Eris was moving so slow, and James kept watching her with this worried look on his face. When we sat down to eat, Eris dropped her fork, tried to reach the salt, and Simon grabbed it off the floor and put it on the counter. He told her she could eat with her hands since she couldn't handle utensils properly. James stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor, but Grace grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. Eris picked up her chicken with her fingers while tears rolled down her face, and nobody said anything for the rest of dinner. A week later, I woke up with a bad stomach ache, and Eris let me stay home from my lab. She moved around the kitchen, slowly pulling out flour and sugar and her grandmother's old recipe box. She taught me how to cream butter and sugar together and showed me the exact way to roll the dough so the cookies would be perfect. She kept saying these recipes needed to be passed down and made me write everything in my notebook. We spent all morning baking, and she smiled more than I'd seen in weeks, even though she had to sit down every few minutes. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and I answered it because her hand were covered in flour. It was Dr. Hoffman, saying Eris needed to come in immediately about some concerning test results from her last appointment. Simon walked in from the garage and took the phone from me and told the doctor that Eris was fine and they'd come to the regular appointment next week. He hung up and deleted the call from the phone history while Eris asked who it was, and he said it was just a telemarketer. The next day at school, I stayed after class and told my teacher, Mrs. Smith, that I was worried about my foster mom. She asked me gentle questions about what was happening at home, but I was scared to say too much because Simon always said foster kids who cause trouble get sent away. She wrote her personal phone number on a piece of paper and put it in my backpack and told me to call her anytime, day or night, if I needed help. That weekend, I watched Simon drill new locks into all the bedroom doors, but these ones locked from the outside instead of inside. He said it was for safety, but I saw him test the lock on their bedroom door while Eris was napping, and the key went straight onto his keychain. 2 weeks later, Eris was working in her lab when she grabbed her stomach and cried out that something was wrong. I called the outpost emergency line on the kitchen phone while Simon stood there, saying she was being dramatic and trying to get attention. The paramedics arrived and checked her and said she was having a severe stress-induced episode and needed to go to the infirmary immediately. Simon refused to ride in the transport and told me we'd visit tomorrow if she was actually admitted and not just making a fuss over nothing. At the infirmary the next day, I sat in the waiting room while Simon talked to the doctor, and I could hear the nurses at their station talking about Eris's condition. One nurse was reading from a chart, saying the words dehydration, malnutrition, and extreme stress. And another nurse said Dr. Hoffman had ordered a full psychological evaluation. I memorized every word to tell someone. But who would believe a 15-year-old kid over a grown-up? Grace showed up at the infirmary while Simon was at work, even though he'd told everyone not to visit because Eris needed rest. She brought me with her, and we went into Eris's room, where she was hooked up to machines that beeped every few seconds. Grace sat on the bed and held Eris's hand and said she and James could see what was happening and they were going to help her. Eris started sobbing so hard the machine started beeping faster, and a nurse came in to check on her. The nurse adjusted Eris's 4 and told Grace visiting hours were almost over when I heard Simon's voice booming down the hallway. My whole body went cold because I knew that angry tone meant trouble for everyone. Grace squeezed Eris's hand tighter while I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. Through the door, I could hear Simon yelling at Grace about how she had no right being there. His footsteps got closer, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to breathe too loud. Grace's voice stayed calm, but I could hear her phone making that little beep it does when you start recording. Simon kept saying stuff about his family and how Grace needed to stay away from them. The bathroom had this tiny window, and I could see the parking lot where his truck was parked crooked across 2 spaces. After what felt like forever, the voices moved away, and Grace knocked on the bathroom door to tell me it was safe. 2 days later, they let Eris come home, but Simon made her sign all these papers at the infirmary desk. A social worker showed up at my lab that same week, trying to talk to me. The lead scientist called me to his office, but then said Simon had called and I couldn't talk to anyone without him there. I started sneaking stuff into my backpack like protein bars and water bottles for Eris. At home, I'd grab her nutrient supplements from the trash when Simon threw them away. When he watched TV, I'd slip the supplies under her pillow with little notes saying they were for her and the project. She found them one night, and tears rolled down her face while she held my hand without saying anything. During computer time in my lab, I searched for Eris's family on a private network, using the library computers. Her mom's profile had all these posts asking Simon to let their daughter call home. The posts said they missed her and just wanted to know she was okay. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to Mrs. Smith's email that she'd given our class for homework. That Friday, Simon announced we were going on an expedition, just him and me, for the whole weekend. Eris tried to stand up from the couch to ask if she could come too. Simon looked at her and said the terrain would be too much for her condition. While he loaded the transport, I saw Eris slip something into my backpack when he wasn't looking. The expedition site was 3 hours away, and Simon kept talking about how nice it would be with just us guys. We set up the tent near a frozen lake and cooked nutrient packs over the fire like everything was normal. That night, after Simon started snoring, I used my flashlight to read Eris's note from my backpack. The paper was folded really small, and her handwriting was shaky, but I could read it. She wrote about the data logs in a drawer and how the project wasn't his and to be brave. At the bottom, she wrote that she loved me like her own son, and my chest felt tight. I realized she thought something bad might happen to her while we were gone. The next morning, Simon made coffee on the camping stove and started asking weird questions. He wanted to know if I'd be okay living with just him if something happened to Eris. He said some kids only have dads, and they turn out fine and even better sometimes. I pretended to be excited about the idea while my brain tried to figure out how to protect Eris. When Simon went to take a shower at the main camp bathroom, I grabbed his phone from the tent. I texted Mrs. Smith from his phone, saying Eris needed help and to check on her. Simon came back before I could delete the message, but he didn't check his phone right away. We packed up Sunday morning and drove home with him singing along to the radio like nothing was wrong. When we pulled into the outpost, I saw the front door was open, which made my stomach drop. Simon stepped over his own doorstep, and I ran inside to find Eris on the bathroom floor. She was holding her stomach, and there was water all over the tiles around her. Simon literally stepped over her to get his keys from the kitchen counter while she moaned in pain. I grabbed the house phone and called the emergency line, screaming our address over and over until they said help was coming. Simon tried to grab the phone from me, but I ran outside to the front yard, still yelling the address. The ambulance came in 8 minutes, but it felt like hours watching Eris on that bathroom floor. At the infirmary, they rushed Eris into the delivery room, and she begged them to let me stay with her. Simon wouldn't go in because he said it wasn't his problem, but the nurses let me hold her hand. The doctor kept saying she was doing great, even though the baby was 5 weeks early. Eris squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, but I didn't let go, even when she screamed. After 2 hours of pushing, the baby finally came out, and the doctor held her up for us to see. The baby had dark skin and curly black hair. And suddenly, I understood everything about why Simon hated Eris. The nurses cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a pink blanket while Eris cried happy tears. Eris named her Sophia and asked if I wanted to hold her first, before anyone else. The baby was so tiny and warm, and her little fingers wrapped around my thumb when I touched her hand. Eris whispered that I was Sophia's brother, and I had to always protect her, no matter what. The nurse took pictures of the three of us together with Eris's phone to save the moment. I noticed the doctor writing a lot of notes in Eris's chart about her condition and injuries. 2 days went by with Eris getting stronger and the nurses teaching her how to care for Sophia. Simon finally showed up at the infirmary, but he wouldn't even look at the baby. The nurse brought him the birth certificate to sign, and he pushed it away. He told everyone in the room he wasn't the father and wasn't signing anything. The nurse called for Dr. Hoffman, who tried talking to him, but Simon kept yelling about not being responsible for someone else's kid. Hospital security showed up when Simon grabbed my arm and tried pulling me toward the exit while Eris was still hooked up to monitors. They blocked the door and told him he couldn't take me anywhere without proper documentation. A social worker arrived an hour later with a thick folder of papers and 2 other people. She took me to a quiet room where a nice lady with glasses asked me questions while the social worker wrote everything down. I showed them all the photos on my phone of the lock Simon put on doors and Eris's bruises. I played the recordings from the tablet, where Simon called Eris horrible names and threatened her. The social worker's face got more and more serious as she looked through everything. The lady with glasses asked if I felt safe going home with Simon, and I shook my head no. Grace and James showed up that afternoon with a bag of clothes and some of my toys from home. Grace hugged me tight and whispered that they'd been watching everything, too, and taking pictures at family dinners. James pulled out his phone and showed me photos he'd secretly taken of Eris's black eyes and the bruises on her arms. He'd been documenting everything for months without Simon knowing. The next morning, Simon burst into the infirmary with a man in a suit who said he was Simon's lawyer. The lawyer waved papers around, saying Simon had legal guardianship and I had to leave with them immediately. The social worker stood between them and me and said there was an active investigation into abuse and neglect. Simon's face turned red, and he started threatening to sue the hospital, social services, and everyone else in the room. The lawyer kept repeating that Eris had signed the papers, giving Simon full custody rights. Security had to escort them out when Simon started pushing chairs and yelling. That night, the social worker drove me to a house across town where an older couple was waiting on the porch. They were my emergency foster parents and seemed nice, but confused about the whole situation. The woman showed me to a small bedroom with dinosaur sheets and said I could call them Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. I couldn't sleep at all, thinking about Eris and Sophia alone in the infirmary without me there to help. Around midnight, I called Mrs. Smith from the phone in the kitchen, and she promised she'd visit Eris first thing in the morning. Mrs. Davis from down the street picked me up early and drove me back to the infirmary before the custody hearing. Eris was sitting up in bed, feeding Sophia, and she looked so tired but determined when she saw me. She reached out her free hand and pulled me close. "I'm going to fight for you," she said quietly. "For both of you. I'm done being afraid." We had to leave for family court an hour later, where Simon's lawyer stood up and argued I should go home immediately. He kept talking about the signed papers and how Simon had been my guardian for years without any problems. The social worker presented a stack of evidence, including the photos, recordings, and statement from neighbors about the abuse. The judge looked through everything slowly while Simon sat there, glaring at Eris. After what felt like forever, the judge said I would stay in temporary foster care while they investigated everything properly. Simon slammed his fist on the table and stormed out of the courtroom with his lawyer following behind. That afternoon, a different man came to Eris's hospital room and introduced himself as David Park, her new attorney. Grace and James were paying for him, and he seemed really smart and organized. He sat down with Eris and went through all the guardianship papers, page by page. "These were signed under duress," he explained. "We can fight this." He took photos of all Eris's injuries and wrote down everything she told him about the abuse. The Johnsons brought me to visit Eris and Sophia every single day after that. I learned how to hold Sophia's bottle just right and would sing the songs Eris taught me when Sophia cried. The nurses all smiled and said I was such a good big brother to her. One nurse, named Patricia, slipped me a piece of paper with her phone number and whispered to call if I ever needed anything. 3 days later, I was in Eris's room when an older woman rushed in, crying. Eris gasped, and they hugged for so long, both sobbing. It was Eris's mom, who'd flown in from California after Mrs. Smith had tracked her down and called her. Eris's mom pulled out her phone and showed the social worker dozens of text messages from Simon, threatening her if she ever contacted Eris. She had voicemails, too, where Simon said he'd hurt Eris if her mom tried visiting or calling. Eris hadn't known her mom had been trying to reach her for months because Simon had been deleting all her messages and blocking her calls. A week later, Dr. Hoffman sat in a conference room at the lawyer's office with stacks of medical records spread across the table. She pointed to Eris's weight chart, showing she'd lost 15 pounds during her pregnancy instead of gaining weight. The blood pressure readings got worse with each visit, and Eris had started showing signs of severe anxiety that Dr. Hoffman had never seen before. Dr. Hoffman pulled out photos she'd taken of bruises on Eris's arms during appointments and showed how Eris would flinch whenever anyone moved too fast near her. The lawyer recorded everything while Dr. Hoffman explained how Eris would cry through entire appointments and beg her not to call Simon about anything. That same afternoon, the social worker took me to meet with a child psychologist at a building downtown with toys everywhere. The therapist had me play with action figures while asking questions about home, and I showed her how Dad would push Mom away when she tried to hug him. I built a house with blocks, then knocked down the Mom figure's room, saying, "That's what Dad did with Mom's stuff." The therapist wrote notes as I acted out dinner time with the Dad figure sitting far away from everyone else and the Mom figure crying in the corner. I told her about the time Mom fell down the stairs and Dad stepped over her to get to the kitchen. Meanwhile, Simon had driven to our house with a moving truck while Eris was still recovering in the hospital. The neighbors saw him throwing Eris's clothes into garbage bags and called the police, but Simon showed them the deed with only his name on it. James and Grace got there just as Simon was dragging Eris's grandmother's rocking chair to the curb, along with all the baby furniture they'd bought together. Grace grabbed photo albums and my school project from the trash, while James loaded what he could save into his truck. Simon had already changed all the locks and removed Eris's name from the mailbox by the time they left with 2 trucks full of her belongings. 3 days later, Eris's mom wheeled her out of the hospital with baby Sophia wrapped in a hospital blanket since Simon had thrown away all the baby clothes. They took a taxi to the hotel where Eris's mom had been staying, and Eris collapsed on the bed, still wearing the same clothes from the hospital. The hotel manager brought up a portable crib someone had left behind, while Eris's mom went to buy formula since Simon had canceled the credit cards. Eris tried calling about her car, but discovered Simon had already reported it stolen and had it towed from the hospital parking lot. Her mom showed her the divorce papers that had been served at the hospital, claiming Eris was an unfit mother who had cheated and abandoned her foster child. The papers demanded full custody of me and stated Eris owed Simon money for emotional damage and fraudulent marriage. Eris could barely hold Sophia while reading about how Simon described her as mentally unstable and dangerous to children. 2 weeks passed before I figured out which hotel Eris was staying at by listening to the social worker's phone calls. I waited until the foster family was asleep, then climbed out the bedroom window and walked 6 blocks to the bus stop. The bus driver almost didn't let me on until I showed him the emergency $20 bill the social worker had given me for situations like this. I knocked on Eris's hotel room door, and she answered, holding Sophia with dark circles under her eyes. We spent the whole afternoon on the hotel bed, with Eris's mom making sandwiches while I held Sophia and taught her to grab my finger. Eris kept apologizing for everything, but I told her about the paternity test I'd found and how I knew Dad had been planning this. Her mom took pictures of us together, and Eris said this felt like what family was supposed to be. Nobody mentioned that I'd have to go back to foster care in a few hours, or that Simon was trying to take me away forever. David's law office had papers stacked to the ceiling when Eris and her mom arrived for their appointment the next morning. David had already filed countermotions for divorce, with Eris as the victim of domestic abuse and financial control. He submitted custody petitions for both me and Sophia, along with emergency requests for spousal support since Simon had left Eris with nothing. The criminal charges included domestic abuse, neglect of a pregnant woman, and theft of Eris's personal property. David showed them how Simon had hidden money in offshore accounts and had been planning this for months before Sophia was even born. The legal battle was officially starting, and David warned them Simon would fight dirty, using his money and connections. 3 days later, The school secretary found me in the library when she said someone was here to see me. Simon stood in the hallway, despite the restraining order that said he couldn't come within 500 feet of me. He grabbed my shoulders and said Eris didn't want me any more now that she had her real baby. He kept saying she chose Sophia over me, and that's why she hadn't fought to keep me. The security guard heard me screaming and pulled Simon away while he kept yelling that Eris abandoned me. Mrs. Smith held me in the principal's office while we waited for the social worker, and I couldn't stop shaking. The police took Simon away, but the damage was done because I kept hearing his word about Eris choosing her real baby. 2 weeks after that, James sat in another conference room, telling lawyers about his brother's behavior over the years. He brought bank statements showing Simon had been moving money around since before Eris got pregnant. James described how Simon had always been controlling, but it got worse when he found out Eris was pregnant with another man's baby. He told them about family dinners where Simon would humiliate Eris, and how he'd seen Simon push her when he thought nobody was watching. James's voice cracked when he admitted he should have done something sooner, but he'd been afraid of his brother. The lawyer asked if James would testify in court, and James said he'd do whatever it took to help Eris and me. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand while he explained how Simon had been planning this whole thing to destroy Eris. The next Monday, the social worker drove me to the CPS office for my supervised visit with Simon in a small room with toys and a two-way mirror. Simon sat across from me, trying to act like the perfect dad, while the social worker took notes in the corner. He kept saying Eris was going to give me up for adoption now that she had Sophia and didn't need a foster kid anymore. He told me she'd already started the paperwork to get rid of me and find a family who actually wanted me. I remembered the recording device the social worker had given me, hidden in my pocket, and pressed the button while Simon continued. He said Eris only kept me around for the foster care checks, and now that she had a real baby, she was done pretending. Simon didn't notice the red light blinking in my pocket while he tried to convince me Eris never loved me. The social worker finally ended the visit when she saw me crying, but the device had recorded everything Simon said. Later that week, David called Eris's mom with news that made them both go silent on the phone. His investigator had discovered Simon never actually filed the adoption papers for me, despite telling everyone the adoption was finalized. All those months when Simon said I was officially their son were lies, and I'd been in legal limbo the whole time. The foster care payments had been going to Simon, but he'd never done the paperwork to make me legally theirs. This meant Eris could petition for custody on her own without needing Simon's permission or involvement. David said this changed everything because Eris could fight for me separately from the divorce proceedings. The next week, David tracked down Sophia's real dad through hospital records and social media searches. He was some guy named Alex who Eris dated for like 3 months after she and Simon broke up the first time, years ago. Alex showed up at David's office, wearing work clothes and looking confused about why he was there. David showed him the paternity test results and explained the whole situation with Simon and the abuse. Alex signed papers giving up any rights to Sophia without even asking to see her. He told David he had his own family now and didn't want any part of this mess. David said that was actually good for us because it meant one less person who could fight for custody. I started seeing a therapist twice a week at this place downtown with toys and art supplies everywhere. The therapist lady asked me to draw my family, and I drew Eris holding Sophia with me, standing next to them. I put Simon in the corner as this dark cloud thing hovering over us. She asked me to draw more pictures, and I always put Eris and Sophia in the middle with bright colors. Simon was always the shadow or monster thing on the edges. She wrote lots of notes while I drew and played with the toys. 3 weeks later, we had to go to court for a custody hearing about me. Simon's lawyer stood up and said Eris cheated on Simon and lied about the baby. He said she committed fraud by letting Simon think the baby was his. David jumped up with a whole folder of evidence showing Simon knew about the paternity test 5 months ago. He had copies of Simon's internet searches about paternity tests from way before Sophia was born. He showed the judge Simon's credit card records, buying the test himself. The judge looked through all the papers and said she wanted a full investigation into everything. She scheduled another hearing for next month and told both lawyers to get all their evidence ready. A month later, David got this call from a forensic accountant he'd hired to look into Simon's finances. Turns out Eris's grandma had left her money when she died 2 years ago, but Eris never knew about it. Simon had been taking money from that account the whole time, using Eris's information. The accountant found over $50,000 missing with Simon's name on the withdrawals. David filed criminal charges that same day for theft and fraud. 2 weeks after that, I had to talk to the judge in her office with just a child advocate there. The judge asked me where I wanted to live, and I told her with Eris and Sophia. I showed her all the recordings I'd made on my tablet of Simon being mean to Eris. I had photos I'd taken of Eris crying and Simon ignoring her when she needed help. The judge looked at everything and said I was very brave for documenting all this. She said the decision would take time, but she understood what I wanted. That night, Simon showed up at the hotel where Eris's mom was staying, even though the restraining order said he couldn't come near any of us. He pounded on the door, screaming about how I was his son and Eris had no right to take me. Eris's mom called 911 while Eris held Sophia and I hid in the bathroom. I could hear him kicking the door and yelling that he'd kill Eris if she didn't give me back. The police showed up fast with their sirens on, and I watched from the window as they put him in handcuffs. He kept fighting them and screaming my name while they push him into the police car. With Simon in jail, waiting for his bail hearing, Eris asked the court for emergency custody of me. The judge granted it right away since Simon was locked up and couldn't take care of me anyway. Grace helped Eris rent this small apartment, and I moved in with Eris and her mom and Sophia. I helped take care of Sophia every day while Eris was still recovering from everything. I read her stories at night and helped make her bottles the way Eris showed me. I'd sing the songs Eris taught me when Sophia was crying. Eris's mom cooked food from their country that smelled amazing and made the apartment feel like home. 2 weeks later, Simon's parents paid his bail and got him out of jail. They believed everything he told them about Eris being a cheater who stole their grandson. They filed papers asking for grandparent rights to see me, even though they'd barely visited before. David said this made everything more complicated, and a legal battle could go on for months now. Then, 3 days later, this woman showed up at David's office, saying she was my real mom and wanted me back. David did some digging and found out Simon had contacted her and offered her money to file for custody. She'd abandoned me when I was 2 and hadn't tried to see me in 5 years. But legally, she was still my birth mother, and that gave her rights that Eris didn't have yet. That night, I woke up screaming because I dreamed this lady I'd never seen before was dragging me away from Eris while Sophia cried and cried. Eris rushed into my room and sat on the floor next to my bed, holding my hand until morning. She kept saying we'd figure it out, but her eyes were puffy, and I knew she'd been crying too. The next night, the same dream came back, except this time Simon was there, laughing, while the woman pulled me into a car. Eris brought her pillow and blanket and slept on my floor for the rest of the week. Every time I woke up scared, she'd grab my hand and whisper that she'd fight for me, no matter what. The social worker called David the next morning, saying she'd done some digging on my birth mother. She'd found arrest records in 3 different states for drug possession and child abandonment charges from when she left 2 other kids with relatives and never came back. The social worker wrote in her report that placement with her would be dangerous, but legally, she still had to do the assessment since parental rights hadn't been terminated yet. 2 weeks later, we had to go to Simon's criminal trial, and I had to sit in that big chair next to the judge and tell everyone what happened. I told them about the locks on the cabinets and how he wouldn't let Eris eat. I told them about hiding her medicine and making her walk to the hospital alone. I told them about stepping over her when she was on the bathroom floor in labor. Simon sat at his table, staring at me the whole time with this look like he wanted to hurt me. His lawyer kept trying to make it sound like I was confused or making things up, but I just kept telling what I saw. The prosecutor showed pictures of the locks and the empty medicine bottles in the trash that I'd taken with Eris's phone. 3 months went by with court dates and meetings and more court dates. Eris found a job at a daycare where she could bring Sophia, and I'd go there after school instead of going home. We'd play with the little kids and help clean up while Eris worked. Grace and James kept giving Eris money for David's fees, even though she tried to say no. We were building something that felt normal, even with all the legal stuff happening. My birth mother was supposed to come for her first supervised visit at the CPS office, but she never showed up. The social worker waited 2 hours and documented everything. The second visit, she called an hour late, saying her car broke down. But the social worker checked, and she'd been arrested that morning for shoplifting. The third visit, she just didn't come or call at all. Her lawyer sent David a letter saying he was withdrawing from her case because she wouldn't return his calls. The social worker started putting together paperwork for abandonment and said this would help our case. Then Simon's parents hired some guy to follow us around and take pictures. I saw him outside the daycare, taking photos of Eris carrying Sophia to the car. He talked to our neighbors, and one of them mentioned seeing me climb out my window that night to go to Eris's apartment. Simon's lawyer filed papers saying Eris was encouraging me to break rules and run away. Eris's health started getting better once she wasn't stressed all the time. She gained weight back, and her skin wasn't so pale anymore. She smiled more and started talking about going back to school online. At night, after Sophia went to sleep, we'd sit at the kitchen table, and I'd help her with her homework while she helped me with mine. She was taking classes to finish her degree in early childhood education. Mrs. Smith from school had to go to court as a witness for Eris. She brought this whole folder of papers showing all the times I'd come to her worried about Eris and how my grades were good and I never got in trouble. She told the judge that anyone who said Eris wasn't my real mom didn't understand what real meant. Simon's parents' lawyer tried to make her look bad, but she just kept showing more evidence of how well I was doing with Eris. Finally, the criminal trial verdict came, and Simon was found guilty of domestic violence and violating the restraining order. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison, and he had to take anger management classes. His parents stood up and yelled that they'd keep fighting for custody of me. The bailiff had to make them leave. Simon turned and looked at me one more time before they took him away in handcuffs. 6 months after Eris and I had moved into our apartment, David filed papers to terminate Simon's parental rights based on his criminal conviction and all the documented abuse. He said it would take months more, but it was the first step toward Eris being able to adopt me legally. Summer ended, and I walked into my old school wearing the new backpack Eris bought me. Kids from my old class crowded around, asking where I'd been. I told them I live with my mom and baby sister now. Some parents whispered to each other when they saw Eris at pickup, but I didn't care. 2 weeks later, we got a court summons saying Simon's parents were suing for grandparent rights. They claimed Eris was keeping me from them on purpose. The hearing was set for October, and Eris spent nights going through papers with David. When the court date came, Grace and James showed up to testify. Grace told the judge how Simon's parents knew he was hurting Eris, but never said anything. James showed texts where they told him not to interfere in Simon's marriage. The judge asked Simon's parents why they never reported the abuse. They couldn't answer. The petition was denied, and Simon's dad stood up, yelling that this wasn't over. Security had to escort them out. That night, Sophia started crawling for the first time. She pushed herself up on her hands and knees and moved straight toward me. Eris grabbed her phone and recorded it. Sophia reached my feet and grabbed my sock, pulling herself closer. I helped her sit up, and she smiled so big. We spent the next weekend putting locks on cabinets and covers on outlets. Sophia followed me everywhere, using furniture to pull herself along. 3 weeks later, the social worker called with news about my biological mother. She'd agreed to give up her parental rights if Simon's parents paid off her debts. They sent $30,000 to her creditors, and she signed the papers. The social worker filed them with the court the same day. One more barrier gone, Eris said. But then everything went bad again. A CPS investigator showed up at our door, saying they'd received a complaint. Simon had written from prison, claiming Eris was neglecting me. The investigator asked to see my room and look through our fridge. She interviewed me alone for an hour, asking about meals and bedtime at school. Eris had to show bank statements proving she could support us. The investigator checked Sophia's crib and our medicine cabinet. She took pictures of everything. After she left, Eris sat on the couch and cried. I'd never seen her that scared before. We waited 3 weeks for the results. David called, saying not only did CPS find no problems, they recommended speeding up the adoption. The investigator wrote that our home was loving and stable. She noted how I called Eris mom without prompting. 8 months of legal fights, and we were closer, but Simon still had rights. In March, I won an award at school for an essay about family. I wrote that DNA doesn't make someone your parent. Love does. Eris and her mom cried when I read it at the assembly. Sophia clapped, even though she didn't understand. The principal said it was the best essay a second grader had ever written. Eris framed the certificate and hung it in our living room. 2 days later, She drove to the state prison to see Simon. She offered to drop the fraud charges if he'd sign away his rights to me. I waited at Grace's house, playing video games, but thinking about what was happening. Eris came back looking tired. Simon had called me his property and said he'd never let her have me. She was quiet at dinner, but I could see her thinking. The next morning, she called David about other options. Grace and James filed paperwork to become my official godparents that week. They included letters from teachers and neighbors supporting them. The court approved it in April, giving me backup guardians if anything happened to Eris. Then Simon's parents tried one last time. They showed up at Eris's work with a cashier's check for $100,000. Eris's co-worker heard them say they'd pay her to give me to them. Eris tore up the check in front of them. They said they'd drain her money in court until she gave up. That night, Eris's mom called from California. She was selling her house to help pay for lawyers. Eris tried to refuse, but her mom had already listed it. The house sold in 2 weeks, and the money went into David's trust account for legal fees. 10 months of court dates and lawyer meetings wore Eris down until her clothes hung loose on her body. I started making her breakfast every morning while she fed Sophia, packed both their lunches, did laundry after school, and cleaned the kitchen after dinner. The dark circles under Eris's eyes got worse each time Simon's parents filed another motion. They wanted overnight visits, then weekend custody, then full guardianship, claiming Eris was an unfit mother. David filed response after response, each one costing thousands from Eris's mom's house money. I watched Eris count bills at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she moved money between envelopes marked rent, food, and legal fees. She stopped eating dinner most nights, giving her portions to me and Sophia. I started hiding granola bars in her purse and making extra sandwiches for her lunch. The hearing for grandparent rights finally came after 6 months of delays. Simon's parents brought 3 lawyers and sat there in their expensive clothes while Eris had just David. The judge listened to their arguments about their rights as grandparents, how they deserved access to me. David stood up with a thick folder of evidence. He showed the judge photos of my bruises, the hospital records, the police reports they never filed when I begged them for help. He read my old texts, asking them to make Simon stop hurting me. The judge's face got harder with each piece of evidence. Simon's parents tried arguing they didn't know how bad it was. The judge cut them off and said they had failed to protect me from abuse they clearly knew about. She ordered them to pay all of Eris's legal fees and denied their petition for any visitation rights. They stormed out, yelling about appeals, while their lawyer shook his head. 3 days later, we went to the park for a picnic with Eris's mom, who had flown in from California. Sophia crawled on the blanket, grabbing at grass while I helped set out sandwiches. Eris actually smiled for the first time in weeks. Lying back on the blanket, watching clouds. An older woman walking her dog stopped to comment how cute Sophia was, then looked at me helping Sophia stand. She said we had the same stubborn chin and way of tilting our heads. Eris's mom laughed and agreed we acted like real siblings. For one afternoon, we felt like a normal family, eating sandwiches and playing frisbee. David called that evening, saying he was ready to file for termination of Simon's parental rights. He had everything documented, including the criminal conviction, the proven abuse, Simon refusing visits for 8 months, and 0 financial support. The judge scheduled the final hearing for 6 weeks out. Eris threw up after hanging up the phone from nerves. 2 weeks before the hearing, Simon got jumped in prison and ended up in the hospital with broken ribs. His parents went to every news station with photos of him bandaged up, saying the stress of losing me caused his attack. They painted Eris as a vindictive woman who stole their grandchild and turned their son into a target. The story went viral online, with people who didn't know the real story attacking Eris. Our mailbox filled with hate mail, calling her a home wrecker and kidnapper. People found her Facebook and left death threats. Someone spray-painted "baby thief" on our car. Eris started packing suitcases one night, saying we should just disappear and start over somewhere new. I unpacked everything while she cried on the bed. I told her we don't run from bullies because that's what she taught me when Simon scared me. She held me tight and we stayed. Grace and James saw the news coverage and got angry about the lies. They posted all their evidence online, including videos they'd secretly recorded of Simon hitting me, photos of my injuries, and screenshots of him admitting the abuse in texts. They wrote a long post about watching their nephew get abused and feeling helpless. The story shifted overnight as people saw the truth. 3 women from Simon's college came forward, saying he'd abused them, too. One had a restraining order from sophomore year. Another had hospital records from when he broke a wrist. The news stations had to issue corrections. The final termination hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. Simon appeared on a video screen from prison in his orange jumpsuit. He tried to cry, but no tears came as he talked about being a changed man who deserved another chance. He said he loved me and made mistakes, but wanted to be my father. The judge asked if anyone else wanted to speak. I raised my hand, and David helped me stand. My voice shook, but I looked right at the screen and told the judge that Simon never loved me, just used me to hurt Eris. I said Eris was my real mom because she chose to love me even when it cost her everything. The judge thanked me and said she would review everything and issue her decision within a week. That week felt like a year, with Eris unable to eat or sleep. I made her toast she didn't touch, and Sophia seemed to sense the stress, crying more than usual. The social worker found me sobbing in my closet one night, scared they would make me leave the only real family I'd ever had. She held me and promised she'd already recommended Eris for permanent custody. Friday afternoon, David called, saying the judge made her decision. We drove to the courthouse with Eris's hands shaking so bad she couldn't buckle her seatbelt. The judge read her decision, stating Simon's parental rights were terminated based on severe abuse, criminal conviction, abandonment, and failure to provide support. Eris collapsed into the chair, sobbing with relief while I jumped into her arms. Even Sophia started laughing and clapping like she understood we were finally safe and officially a family. The social worker started the adoption paperwork right there in the courthouse hallway while Eris was still wiping tears from her face. Over the next few weeks, the social worker fast-tracked everything she could, calling in favors from judges and pushing through the home study faster than anyone thought possible. Grace and James wrote reference letters, saying how Eris had protected me when nobody else would. Dr. Hoffman wrote about Eris's strength during her pregnancy and how she always put me first. Mrs. Smith from next door wrote about seeing Eris teach me to ride a bike and help with homework every night. The background checks came back clean, and the social worker scheduled meetings with adoption specialists who all agreed this was the best outcome. Eris had to fill out hundreds of forms about her income, her apartment, her family history, everything. I helped by organizing all the papers into folders and making sure she ate when she got too focused on the paperwork. One afternoon, the social worker called to say we needed to pick my new legal name for the adoption certificate. Eris said I could keep my first name or change everything if I wanted. I thought about it for 3 whole days, writing different combinations on notebook paper. Finally, I told her I wanted to be Tyler James Park Martinez, taking her maiden name, Park, and adding Martinez from her mother's side, plus James for the uncle who stood up for us in court. Eris cried when I explained I wanted a name that showed who really loved me. 3 months passed with more meetings, more paperwork, and more waiting, until finally the adoption day arrived. The courtroom was packed with everyone who had supported us, including Grace, James, Dr. Hoffman, the social worker, Mrs. Smith, and even some nurses from the hospital. The judge read through all the documents and asked Eris if she understood she was taking full legal responsibility for me forever. Eris said, yes, so loud that Sophia jumped in her carrier. Then the judge asked me if I wanted Eris to be my legal mother, and I practically shouted, yes, before she finished the question. The judge smiled and signed the papers, making it official. Then she let me bang the gavel, which is a tradition for adoption cases. Sophia started babbling, and it sounded exactly like she was saying "tai-tai," which became her first real word, right there in the courtroom. Everyone clapped and took pictures while Eris held me so tight I could barely breathe. At the adoption party that afternoon at a pizza place, Eris asked me to stand up because I had something to say. I pulled out a letter I'd been writing for weeks and read it to everyone, but mostly to her. I told her she chose me when I was broken and fought for me when I had no voice and loved me when my blood family didn't. I said she wasn't my foster mom or adoptive mom anymore, just my mom. Eris was crying so hard she couldn't talk and just pulled me into another hug while everyone else was wiping their eyes, too. 6 months after the adoption, we moved to a bigger apartment with 3 bedrooms so Sophia and I could each have our own space. Eris's mom had moved in permanently to help with everything, and we spent a whole weekend painting Sophia's room pink while Eris and I painted mine blue. Eris watched us work together and said our family didn't look traditional, but it was perfect for us. By the time I started middle school, I felt confident and secure in a way I never had before. When kids asked about my dad, I just said matter-of-factly that I didn't have one, but I had the best mom and sister in the world. I was still going to therapy, but only once a month now instead of every week. The therapist said I was processing everything really well and that having a stable home made all the difference. One afternoon, a letter arrived with Simon's prison return address on it. I asked Eris to read it first in case it said something bad, but she looked at the envelope and threw it straight in the trash without opening it. She said he had no power here anymore and we should go plant a garden instead, something that would actually grow. We spent the rest of the day planting tomatoes and flowers in the little patch of dirt behind our apartment building. A few weeks later, I was playing on the floor with Sophia when she suddenly stood up and took her first real steps, going from Eris to me. I caught her and spun her around while she giggled, and Eris's mom grabbed her phone to record it. Eris whispered, "My babies," while watching us play together, and I realized she meant both of us equally. For a school assignment about resilience, I decided to interview Eris about her own childhood and what made her so strong. I asked her about growing up and her dreams and how she found the courage to fight for us. When I told her she was my hero, she started crying and said I was hers for being brave enough to speak up and save us all. On Sophia's second birthday, I helped her blow out the candles. And that night, it was my turn to tuck her into bed. I sang her the same lullabies Eris had taught me, the ones in Spanish from Eris's mom. Eris stood in the doorway, watching, with her mother beside her. And when I finished Sophia's song, I walked over to them. "We made it," I said, and the three of us stood there together, looking at Sophia, sleeping peacefully in her crib. We were a family forged by choice instead of blood, tested by fire and Simon's cruelty. But we were stronger for it. Eris pulled me close and kissed the top of my head while her mother wrapped her arms around both of us. Outside the window, the garden we planted was starting to bloom with tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. Sophia stirred in her sleep and mumbled, "Tai tai," which still made me smile every time. This was our family, our home, our future that we'd build together one day at a time.